So a scaled item, or a 1 to 9 scale. So it's actually someone's name and they pronounce it Likert. Can you believe that? So for years you've been saying Likert items or Likert scale. In fact, this person's last name is Likert. So I'm going to try to get that right, but I'm probably going to only be 50-50 on it. But the idea is simply that there's an anchor or a description at least the low point and the high point. So you can see here in my work, I use the example of not at all and an extreme amount, so that it's not really written up for people to know exactly what I think each of those buckets are. There's different ways, and this is obviously used throughout social science and a lot of other research areas. At the bottom of the slide has that sad scale that maybe some of us have seen when we've been at the doctor's office or in the hospital, where they ask you to manage your pain or your comfort level, right? So this is definitely the idea of scaled items is something that basically most global communities are familiar with. So you're asking a statement and then you're being asked to answer one of those buckets, right? You're putting your response in a bucket. And the reason a 7 to 9 scale, one of the reasons it can be more useful is it sort of offers you more buckets. So you can start to see more of those nuances, right? Because we have 1 to 9. We know there's an order, so that's kind of ordinal in its approach. 1 is lower than 9. And we also see visually that we think those categories are the same amount of difference from one another, but we don't really know how an individual is looking at that to know what's the difference. Am I a scientist? Would I say I agree or I strongly agree? That can be difficult to know that everybody's sort of approaching that in the same way. So welcome to the grayness of social science research, but also this is important to think about because like Kevin just said, sometimes like mostly normal data, and that's okay to still use it, right? So sometimes it's not as black and white as we might like to see for kind of these dividing lines on different statistics. Just a quick tip, if you're utilizing this, it's always easiest to quantify when 1 is the lowest score, so that you just mathematically, your brain will be wrapped around it a little bit easier. And sometimes what people do is they may have a sequence of 10 questions and they'll have the responses to each of those questions, 6, 7, 1. And you can add up those scores and maybe be able to form some groups from that. So like Kevin just formed groups around low, medium, high when they were thinking about, kind of the CO2 emissions. We could also think about, if I'm looking at my personal values, maybe there's a certain set of data that are starting to form together and I could start to form personal values groups from that. There's also typically ones, questions around if somebody surveyed me on how do I feel about taxes, how do I feel about the environment, about women's health, you might be able to then put me into a political category from those questions. And that would simply be adding up those different responses.